1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 60. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 20. Silsilis and Edfu, Part 3. Edfu and Dendera may almost be called twin temples. They belong to the same period. They are built very nearly after the same plan. They are even allied in a religious sense, for the myths of Horus and Hathor are interdependent, the one being the complement of the other. Thus, in the inscriptions of Edfu we find perpetual allusion to the cultus of Dendera, and vice versa. Both Edfu and Dendera are rich in descriptions, but as the extent of wall space is greater at Edfu, so is the literary wealth of this temple greater than the literary wealth of Dendera. Every wall, every ceiling, every pillar, every architrave, every passage and side chamber, however dark, every staircase, every doorway, the outer wall of the temple, the inner side of the great wall of circuit, the huge pylons from top to bottom, are not only covered but crowded with figures and hieroglyphs. Among these we find no enormous battle subjects as at Abu Simbel, no heroic recitals like the poem of Pentar. Those went out with the pharaohs, and were succeeded by tableaux of religious rites and dialogues of gods and kings. Such are the stock subjects of Ptolemaic edifices. They abound at Dendera and Esna, as well as at Edfu. But at Edfu there are more inscriptions of a miscellaneous character than in any temple of Egypt, and it is precisely this secular information which is so priceless. Here are geographical lists of Nubian and Egyptian nomes, with their principal cities, their products, and their tutelary gods, lists of tributary provinces and princes, lists of temples, and of the lands pertaining thereunto, lists of canals, of ports, of lakes, calendars of feasts and fasts, astronomical tables, genealogies and chronicles of the gods, lists of the priests and priestesses of both Edfu and Dendera, with their names, lists also of singers and assistant functionaries, lists of offerings, hymns, invocations, and such a profusion of religious legends as make the walls of Edfu alone a complete textbook of Egyptian mythology. No great collection of these inscriptions, like the Dendera of Mariette, has yet been published. But every now and then some enterprising Egyptologist, such as M. Naville or M. Jacques de Rouget, plunges for a while into the depths of the Edfu mine and brings back as much precious ore as he can carry. Some most singular and interesting details have thus been brought to light. One inscription, for instance, records exactly in what month, and on what day, and at what hour, Isis gave birth to Horus. Another tells us about the sacred boats. We know that Edfu possessed at least two, and that one was called Horhat, or the first Horus, and the other Mafek, or Great of Turquoise. These boats, it would appear, were not merely for carrying in procession, but for actual use upon the water. Another text, one of the most curious, informs us that Hathor of Dendera paid an annual visit to Horus, or Horhat, of Edfu, and spent some days with him in his temple. The whole ceremonial of this fantastic trip is given in detail. The goddess travelled in her boat, called Neb Mertet, or Lady of the Lake. Horus, like a polite host, went out in his boat Horhat to meet her. The two deities with their attendants then formed one procession and so came to Edfu, where the goddess was entertained with a succession of festivals. One would like to know whether Horus duly returned all these visits, and if the gods, like modern emperors, had a gay time among themselves. Other questions inevitably suggest themselves, sometimes painfully, sometimes ludicrously, as one paces chamber after chamber, corridor after corridor, sculptured all over with strange forms and stranger legends. What about these gods whose genealogies are so intricate, whose mutual relations are so complicated, who wedded and became parents, who exchanged visits, and who even travelled at times to distant countries? What about those who served them in the temples, who robed and unrobed them, who celebrated their birthdays and paraded them in stately processions, and consumed the lives of millions in erecting these mountains of masonry and sculpture to their honor? We know now with what elaborate rites the gods were adored, what jewels they wore, what hymns were sung in their praise. We know from what a subtle and philosophical core of solar myths their curious personal adventures were evolved. We may also be quite sure that the hidden meaning of these legends was almost wholly lost sight of in the later days of the religion, and that the gods were accepted for what they seemed to be and not for what they symbolized. What then of their worshippers? Did they really believe all these things, or were there any among them tormented with doubts of the gods? Were there skeptics in those days who wondered how two hierogrammates could look each other in the face without laughing? The custode told us that there were 242 steps to the top of each tower of the propylon. We counted 224, and dispensed willingly with the remainder. It was a long pull, but had the steps been 4 times as many, the sight from the top would have been worth the climb. The chambers in the pylons are on a grand scale, with wide beveled windows like the mouths of monster letterboxes, placed at regular intervals all the way up. Through these windows the great flagstaffs and pennons were regulated from within. The 2 pylons communicate by a terrace over the central doorway. The parapet of this terrace and the parapets of the pylons above are plentifully scrawled with names, many of which were left there by the French soldiers of 1799. The cornices of these 2 magnificent towers are unfortunately gone, but the total height without them is 125 feet. From the top, as from the minaret of the great mosque at Damascus, one looks down into the heart of the town. Hundreds of mud huts, thatched with palm leaves, hundreds of little courtyards, lie mapped out beneath one's feet, and, as the fellow lives in his yard by day, using his hut merely as a sleeping place at night, one looks down, like the diable boiteux, upon the domestic doings of a roofless world. We see people moving to and fro, unconscious of strange eyes watching them from above, men lounging, smoking, sleeping in shady corners, children playing, infants crawling on all fours, women cooking at clay ovens in the open air, cows and sheep feeding, poultry scratching and pecking, dogs basking in the sun. The huts look more like the lairs of prairie dogs than the dwellings of human beings. The little mosque, with its one dome and stunted minaret, so small, so far below, looks like a clay toy. Beyond the village, which reaches far and wide, lie barley fields, and cotton patches, and palm groves, bounded on one side by the river, and on the other by the desert. A broad road, dotted over with moving specks of men and cattle, cleaves its way straight through the cultivated land and out across the sandy plain beyond. We can trace its course for miles where it is only a trodden track in the desert. It goes, they tell us, direct to Cairo. On the opposite bank glares a hideous white sugar factory, and bowered in greenery a country villa of the Khedive. The broad Nile flows between. The sweet Theban hills gleam through a pearly haze on the horizon. All at once a fitful breeze springs up, blowing in little gusts and swirling the dust in circles round our feet. At the same moment, like a beautiful spectre, there rises from the desert close by an undulating, semi-transparent stalk of yellow sand, which grows higher every moment, and begins moving northward across the plain. Almost at the same instant, another appears a long way off, towards the south, and a third comes gliding mysteriously along the opposite bank. While we are watching the third, the first begins throwing off a wonderful kind of plume, which follows it, waving and melting in the air. And now the stranger from the south comes up at a smooth, tremendous pace, towering at least 500 feet above the desert, till, meeting some cross-current, it is snapped suddenly in twain. The lower half instantly collapses, the upper, after hanging suspended for a moment, spreads and floats slowly like a cloud. In the meanwhile, other and smaller columns form here and there, stalk a little way, waver, disperse, form again, and again drop away in dust. Then the breeze falls, and puts an abrupt end to this extraordinary spectacle. In less than 2 minutes there is not a sand column left. As they came, they vanish, suddenly. Such is the landscape that frames the temple, and the temple, after all, is the sight that one comes up here to see. There it lies, far below our feet, the courtyard with its almost perfect pavement, The flat roof, compact of gigantic monoliths, the wall of circuit with its panoramic sculptures, the portico with its screens and pillars distinct in bright light against inner depths of dark, each pillar a shaft of ivory, each square of dark a block of ebony. So perfect, so solid, so splendid is the whole structure, so simple in unity of plan, so complex in ornament, so majestic in completeness, that one feels as if it solved the whole problem of religious architecture. Take it for what it is, a Ptolemaic structure preserved in all its integrity of strength and finish, it is certainly the finest extant temple in Egypt. It brings before us with even more completeness than Dendera the purposes of its various parts, and the kind of ceremonial for which it was designed. Every corridor and chamber tells its own story. Even the names of the different chambers are graven upon them in such wise that nothing would be easier than to reconstruct the ground plan of the whole building in hieroglyphic nomenclature. That neither the Ptolemaic building nor the Ptolemaic mythos can be accepted as strictly representative of either pure Egyptian art or pure Egyptian thought, must of course be conceded. Both are modified by Greek influences, and have so far departed from the Pharaonic model. But then we have no equally perfect specimen of the Pharaonic model. The Ramesseum is but a grand fragment. Karnak and Medinet Habu are aggregates of many temples and many styles. Abydos is still half buried. Amid so much that is fragmentary, amid so much that is ruined, the one absolutely perfect structure, Ptolemaic though it be, is of incalculable interest and equally incalculable value. While we are dreaming over these things, trying to fancy how it all looked when the sacred flotilla came sweeping up the river yonder, and the procession of Horhat issued forth to meet the goddess guest, while we are half expecting to see the whole brilliant concourse pour out, priests in their robes of panther skin, priestesses with the tinkling sistrum, singers and harpists, and bearers of gifts and emblems, and high functionaries rearing aloft the sacred boat of the god, in this moment a turbaned mueddin comes out upon the rickety wooden gallery of the little minaret below, and intones the call to midday prayer. That plaintive cry has hardly died away before we see men here and there amongst the huts turning towards the east, and assuming the first postures of devotion. The women go on cooking and nursing their babies. I have seen Moslem women at prayer in the mosques of Constantinople, but never in Egypt. Meanwhile, some children catch sight of us, and notwithstanding that we are 125 feet above their heads, burst into a frantic chorus of bakshish. And now, with a last long look at the temple and the wide landscape beyond, we come down again, and go to see a dismal little mamisi 3 parts buried among a wilderness of mounds close by. These mounds, which consist almost entirely of crude brick débris with embedded fragments of stone and pottery, are built up like coral reefs, and represent the dwellings of some 60 generations. When they are cut straight through, as here round about the great temple, the substance of them looks like rich plum cake. End of section 60.